Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Perry with the Circle of Atonement, here with Circle founder Robert Perry. And today we are going to walk you through an interview that Course scribe Helen Schucman gave, where she describes how the Course came through in her own words. It's a remarkable audio, for one, because it's basically the only audio we have of her, which is a shame because she is a very clear communicator and she has such a great voice. Judy once said that Helen had a polished intellect, and that really comes through in what we hear from her. The interview is 13 minutes long, and it was conducted in August of 1976, so 2 months after the course's original publication. It was conducted in California by David Hammond, who was the associate publisher of a magazine called New Realities that is no longer in publication. The interview was found in the archives of New Realities and was only made public after Helen's death in 1981. Evidently, that was a condition of her being recorded, that none of the recordings came out until after she had passed. This audio used to be a DVD sold by the Foundation for Inner Peace. That's how Robert first got a hold of it. But now it's very easy to find on YouTube. And as we'll cover, the interview focuses on how Helen heard the voice that dictated A Course in Miracles to her, what she herself has to say about the editing process, what she has to say about her own discomfort with the material, and some early glimpses on how she and those around her, including Bill, Ken Wapnick, and Judy Scutch, applied the material themselves. Robert, it was your idea to do this podcast. You've been very excited about it. So is there anything that you want to say about the recording before we begin?
I can say a few things. First of all, it is great to hear her voice. I know of one other scratchy recording of a thing that she and Bill and Judy Scutch and Ken Wapnick did in North Carolina. It's pretty brief. Here you get 13 minutes of her voice, and I have to say, I love her voice. There's something about her personality that comes through that I find really endearing and interesting. You do get a very clear view from her of her experience of hearing what she called the voice. Very clear. And it's different than a lot of what's out there. And the last thing I'll mention is I think this was only unearthed about 10, 15 years ago. I had heard a story about what must have been the same interview from Judy Scutch Whitson in the 90s. And Jim Boland, the editor of New Realities, was present in that conversation. They were both telling the story. And the way they told it, it was lost. It was gone, never to be found. So the story that has come along with it now is that it was unearthed in the archives of New Realities. And I think it was just like, I don't know how it was found. I'd love to hear the story, but I had reconciled myself to the idea that we would never hear that. So it's great that we have that now.
So glad that we have this recording. And you're right, there is something about her voice. I wish we had more interviews with her.
Yeah.
All right, so let's hear it.
Take it away.
Regarding the voice you heard in Scribing A Course in Miracles, does it come from outside or from within?
There's nothing that I would call ordinary audition about this at all. It doesn't really... It's a curious thing, and it will be very difficult to explain. Somebody asked me, was it as though your hand was moving? No, I wrote perfectly voluntarily in response to. I call it a voice, but a voice has sounds as though it had something to do with hearing. I didn't hear anything. I think it's a sort of hearing that you can't really describe. It doesn't have anything to do with ears or waves hitting a drum or anything on that order. I don't really know. I think maybe I'm using the wrong word when I say hear. I sort of recognized it. It was very rapid. I could even, if I didn't catch a phrase, I could sort of say, would you mind doing that again.
You can tell in this recording that she's really trying to be very careful in describing how the voice came through. She's trying to do that, but it's difficult for her to put it into words.
Yeah, and that comes through for a lot of the interview, her really trying hard to be precise in describing it without a lot of available analogies or examples outside of her experience. So she's very clear that it's not ordinary hearing. She's not hearing a physical sound. She's recognizing something inwardly, and she'll get more clear about what that is. She's also very clear that it wasn't moving her hand for her, and that will come up a few times as well. She is aware of the information she's receiving, and then she voluntarily writes it down. She also mentions how rapid it was. Another thing she mentions about 3 times. It's so rapid that sometimes she has to say, "Would you mind doing that again?" And apparently the voice obliged. So in this first bit, we hear a fair amount that we're going to hear more of as it goes on.
This was in your mind?
This is strictly mental. Otherwise, I would consider it hallucinatory activity. I don't feel it was that.
Is it comparable to anything in terms of how we hear ourselves talk, or like you talk to yourself?
It wasn't my voice. It couldn't have been, because it talked about a whole area with which I am entirely unfamiliar.
What about subvocalizing? When you're subvocalizing, you're hearing the words. You're actually hearing them.
No, there's no vocalization. It's a process that I really would find impossible to explain. It's never happened to me before. I don't have any knowledge of the area, so that I wouldn't be able to say like X or whatever it is, because I wouldn't know what X did.
She's still struggling.
She's still struggling.
To describe what's happening to her. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, she's very clear she's not hearing physical sounds. She would consider that hallucinatory activity. She's hearing something outside of her that's not really outside of her. And I think she would associate that with mental illness. She doesn't want that association at all. She rejects the idea that it's her talking to herself, because that would make it sound like it's her own thoughts. And the reason she gives that this can't come from her is very interesting. The reason she gives is, quote, "It talked about a whole area with which I am entirely unfamiliar." So the subject matter was completely unfamiliar to her. How could she have produced it when the ideas were just foreign to her? He mentions subvocalizing. And if you don't know that term, what that means is, especially when you're reading, you're silently saying the words in your mind. It's almost like you can hear how they sound in your mind. And we don't know it, but when we do that, our vocal cords are being very slightly engaged. We don't feel it, but scientific instruments can measure the vocal cord activity. And Helen's basically saying that's not it, because that, again, if she's subvocalizing, she's the one producing it. If she's talking to herself, if she's subvocalizing, she's the one producing it. And so what he keeps doing is he keeps saying, "Is it like this thing? Is it like that thing?" And she keeps saying a couple different things. One is no, basically because that would mean it was from her. And the other thing she's saying is, when he says, "Is it like this?" she keeps saying, "It's not like anything I've heard of."
You can tell that she's trying to maintain her image as a very intelligent research psychologist. She's like, "No, it's not this. It's not hallucinatory activity," because, as you're saying, I think she has that association with mental illness in her mind. She wants to be, I mean, she's a sharp cookie, Helen, and she wants to make sure that everyone knows that she's still in control. But at the same time, it's really interesting how she describes this voice and the way at which it was delivering a thought system that was completely outside of her. I believe her when she says that.
I think she must have had some understanding. She must have. At the same time, we have to, at least to a certain degree, take her at her word. When in this interview, she repeatedly says, it confused me. I didn't understand it. I'm still trying to catch up with it, etc. But I like your point that draws out something you really feel when listening to this, but I hadn't thought of it until just this moment. She plays the role of the really impartial, intelligent, objective observer. She's like a naturalist walking into the field with her notebook, making drawings, writing things down. You don't get the impression that she has some ego identification or some bias that's trying to run a certain story on this. She is trying to be the intelligent observer and reporter of her own mental process. And I like that.
Yeah, I also believe that she didn't have a lot of personal ego identification with the course and the material. Otherwise, why would she not want this to be published until after she had passed? You know, she didn't originally even want her name associated with the course. And so I believe this wasn't an ego project for her either.
Let's try this.
You could hear the words clearly in your mind, even though you didn't hear a sound?
I knew that that was the word. I think knew may be a better word than heard. I did not know consciously at the beginning of the sentence how it was going to end, and that puts me under a further handicap in terms of ordinary language, because ordinarily, I think if you're going to say a sentence, you know what it's going to be. You sort of get the gestalt immediately. But I didn't. And it came very easily, very rapidly, very smoothly, I guess even painlessly, except that it annoyed me to death, but that's irrelevant. I guess here isn't the right word. I could stop any time or pick it up any time, and I did in cabs and subways and anything, or sort of between telephone calls. But you're raising a question I don't think, Dave, I can answer. I really am trying.
There's so much in that clip. And I think what's interesting, at least as a place to start, is her statement that knew may be a better word than heard. And some think that Helen got a sense of what was coming through and then just put her own words on top of it so that the course came through very generally, but what we're reading in the words came from her own mind. But she's saying something completely different here. You know, she keeps saying, I received these words, but they're not mine.
Well, and I think this very interview has been used to support the view that you're saying that she's not supporting here. Basically, what she's like, Dave's getting on the right track now. He's been sort of, testing this and that and trying different things. And after all of her answers, she shaped him into the right place when he says you could hear the words clearly in your mind, even though you didn't hear a sound. And so she says, yeah, and basically that means that it's not so much hearing in the usual sense. She just knew what the word was. The very first line in her answer says, I knew that was the word. So she didn't audibly hear words, but she knew each word as it came. And we know it was each word, one word, the next word, because she says she didn't know how the sentence would end. She didn't know the gist of the sentence before it started. She mentions normally you get, when you're going to say a sentence, you get the gestalt immediately. Now, the word gestalt, which she would know very well because that's actually a branch of psychology that was much more in vogue back in those days. Gestalt means a whole that's more than the sum of the parts. So when you're going to say a sentence, you get that whole and then you put words to it. And that's precisely what she says she didn't have. She didn't have that whole gist of the sentence. She didn't know how it was going to end. All she got was the parts. One word, another word, another word, until it ends. Now, the other thing she says, which she's already said, now she says more lengthily, is it came easily, rapidly, smoothly, no difficulty, except that it annoyed her to death. And what I get from all of this is that she's struggling with a paradox, okay? Because this is happening in her mind. And when something happens in your mind, you do, if you go to express a thought, you do get that gestalt before you put all the words to it in a sentence. You do know where that sentence is going. It does take effort. It's not totally easy. It's not completely smooth. It's not necessarily rapid. So when something's happening in your mind, it doesn't have really any of the characteristics she's talking about here. And yet that's what's going on. So she's experiencing something in her mind that's as if it's coming from someone else distinctly apart from her.
And that point is so critical, because if you believe that it's just a feeling that Helen gets, but ultimately the words are hers, then you would give her more free rein on the editing. But if it's not her words, then her editing becomes an interference. And so this question of, did Helen just hear the dictation and write down what she heard, or did it come from something, a higher form of her own mind? That's a very important question for us to sort out as course students, because at the end of the day, the editing of the book itself rests on that.
Well, and I mean, so much rests on that. If these are Jesus's words, it's a big deal. Like, who's Helen Schucman? We don't necessarily care that much about her words, but we would care if they were Jesus's words. In New Testament scholarship, there's this term that kind of signifies a quest that's an unattainable quest. And the term is ipsissima verba. And I don't know how you say that. I'm sure it's Latin, but it means the very words, and it means the very words of Jesus. And so that is the unattainable prize that scholars, I think, recognize they're not going to get. But if we had the very words of Jesus, what a big deal that would be. And that's what's at stake here as well. Okay.
Yeah, well said.
So a certain mechanism went on there, because you heard something, you translated into the shorthand style.
Yes, but I'm used to shorthand. I use it for group therapy sessions, so that shorthand is quite familiar to me.
So you don't even
it's really a matter of speed.
So really
I couldn't have kept up with it in ordinary writing.
Oh, you couldn't?
Oh, no, it's very rapid. I needed the shorthand.
Yeah. So he's like, oh,
Go ahead.
you translated it into the shorthand style. And she just jumps in. And I noticed listening to it now that he tries to insert himself and she won't let him, because I think what it is, she doesn't like the idea that she had to translate it into some other form. And she's like, yeah, I write in shorthand all the time. I'm only using that just because, I couldn't keep, it's too rapid for me to keep up with. And, she says she would be able to write in shorthand group therapy sessions. So if life is just tumbling along, and people are talking, you have to write it down. She's just found a way to do that in a way where she can keep up. It's not like she's having to go through some translation process. I think that's what she objects to and why she cuts him off and won't let him in.
Also, what you see in the notes, in addition to her shorthand, which was a real bugger to translate in the CE in creating the book, because you can tell she's got very, very rapid, fast handwriting. And what you see in the notes is that she's actually not going back and doing a lot of editing. And those of us who are writers, anyone who's a writer knows that there's a whole editing process that goes along when you take down the words. You don't see evidence of that in her notes. And also, as you get into the later chapters of the text, it's not only coming through so fast and so clean, but it's coming through in perfect iambic pentameter.
Yeah.
And so it's really, really hard to think that one individual woman could have done all of that. So for me, that's more evidence that she's just writing down something she heard versus making it up as she goes from her own mind.
Oh, yeah. I don't see how. I mean, that's a whole other discussion. I just don't think that's possible. Thought a lot about that. And in addition to the shorthand symbols, she also does a lot of abbreviated words. So she's got a whole little system in her mind for getting speech down rapidly. And you're right. Early on it's a bit different, but as she gets going, like you were saying, you see on her notebook pages very little like crossouts and substitutions. We'll get into this a little bit later. She does do editing after she takes the stuff down. And we'll talk about that. But clearly, if you look at her notebook pages, they look like this sounds. Let's try this.
What about automatic writing? A thing when pen takes over and writes for the person. The person doesn't have any control. Is that similar to what you're describing?
No, that didn't happen at all. I could have stopped at any time, and I frequently did. And I was very frequently interrupted, so that I would have to stop there. I didn't lose awareness of where I was or what I was doing. My interns kept barging in for therapy sessions. Now, Bill always says, well, I'm just naturally dissociated, which I never take as a compliment. But maybe it's that. And I think in a sense it must be, because I haven't caught up with it yet. And I don't understand it, and I still feel very baffled by it. And I'm also still just a little uncomfortable with the material, but I'm getting used to it now. And I'm also getting used to a feeling that it was the right thing to have done. The only curious thing that I do know, and this is curious, I am used to doing pretty much what I want to, and I do make my own decisions. But for some reason or other, it never occurred to me not to do this. I thought that this should be done. I made every effort to keep it without me. I did not want to intrude on it, and I felt that it was a matter of personal integrity not to. I really did not interfere with it. I think the thing that I found upsetting about it was it went against everything I believed, which is very hard to do. But I felt it was much more important. I know what I believe, but I didn't know what this was going to do next. And I was very pleased with its coherence and with its being very consistent, which is something that I would regard as a mandatory criterion. It read very well.
Yeah.
And I know the pain with which I managed to get something to read halfway as well as that, which is very agonizing. And this came out very quickly, talked about a system I don't know anything about, and confused me no end. I'm still cross-eyed.
I love that. I'm still cross-eyed. Oh, wait, just one last little bit here.
That's all I can really say about it.
That's all I can really say about it.
Well, you've said that this is the meatiest part of the interview, and there's a lot here. So we're just going to go through the major points of what Helen has just said one by one. First of all, again, you can tell she wants to make it clear that she's totally in charge of her faculties. I do what I want, that kind of attitude. She takes a lot of pride in that. And she notes, though, pretty early in this segment that Bill said she was naturally dissociated, which she didn't take as a compliment. So let's talk about what that means in the context of this interview, to be dissociated.
So what she's saying is that she is basically frequently interrupting it because she's got interns coming in for therapy sessions and she's got phone calls and this and that. So then she brings in dissociation. And I think what that all means is she could be tuned inwardly, and that could be one track of her mind. As she says, I didn't lose awareness of where I was or what I was doing. So she has both tracks going. Okay. She's interacting with her interns, and she's just put on pause this whole other focus, this inward focus. the two tracks are dissociated. And I think that the problem with that is that those two tracks might run parallel and never really meet and get integrated. Okay. And that's why I think she says, I haven't caught up with it yet. And she ties not catching up with it yet to the dissociation. But I think one of her issues is, just as she doesn't want you to think that she's producing it, she doesn't want you to think some external will has just taken her over. She's steering a delicate middle ground. Okay. It's not her, it's somebody else, but that somebody else is not just puppeting her.
And she's communicating that because she's also saying that she's uncomfortable with the material as well.
Right. And she says so many things. She says it annoys her earlier. She doesn't understand it. She has discomfort. She's baffled by it. I love that. I'm still cross-eyed. I love that. She's confused by it. And all of that's a way of saying, this is not coming from me. How could it come from me when I'm so, uncomfortable, confused, etc. Cross-eyed. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And another interesting thing is that she really portrays not just the words and sentences, but she portrays the whole idea for the project as not coming from her. And you see that when she says, one thing I do know is I'm used to doing pretty much what I want to do. I make my own decisions, but for some reason or other, it never occurred to me not to do this. What she's really saying is she's not used to just going along with someone else's decision, without really questioning it. And yet that's what she did here. So she's basically she doesn't talk about the voice much. She doesn't ever say Jesus. She doesn't give the voice a lot of conscious agency in the way she talks about it. But that's what she's basically saying is somebody else made a decision and uncharacteristically, I went along with it. That's kind of weird for me to do.
Helen is so complex because everyone who knew her talks about what a strong will that she had. And yet, I imagine it must have been difficult for her to feel like that will was not overridden, but at the same time that it had something that it wants you to do that was not the plan for your life.
Yeah. Yeah. The next thing I think is so important about this is she talks about it was important to her to, quote, keep it without me, to keep herself out of it. And while we're talking about this, I'm realizing that's what was so striking to me a minute ago, where she is playing the objective observer of this phenomenon and just standing outside and observing its details and its ways and characteristics. And what she's basically saying is that was the stance she took in the receiving of it. She played just the objective sort of messenger who was just passing this on while keeping herself out of it. So that's a really important point here. She also says something that I think is key to the whole thing, because she says that doing something that goes against everything you believe is hard. But she says, I felt it was much more important. So what it believed, what it had to say was more important than what she believed. So without going into a lot of personification of the voice, without saying very much, she's providing the whole rationale. It was important that this voice have its say. And so even though it went against my beliefs, I set my beliefs aside, I bracketed them so it could speak. So that's really important. And then the last thing I want to
it also speaks to her discomfort with the material that she doesn't mention the voice as being Jesus. We're talking August of 1976. The course has been out for 2 months. She knows damn well that this voice claimed to be Jesus, and she doesn't mention that at all.
Well, she's calling him Jesus and Christ from the first days of her notebooks before the course started coming through. So, and she's having visions of Jesus and so on. She's had no, doubt since the very beginning of this whole thing, but she does not say Jesus once. She doesn't talk about the identity. Maybe Dave was even instructed to not ask, because you'd think an interviewer would ask, and she skirts it and he skirts it. Makes you wonder. I also think that when she's saying that it came super rapidly but read very well, it was coherent, it was consistent, and it read very well. She's basically saying again that this did not come from her, right? You don't just compose really rapidly and it reads super well, which she says is agonizing for her to make that happen. And it's coherent and it's consistent and all of that. You don't do that. Doesn't happen if you're the one composing it. So I do feel like this is the most important chunk. And there's a whole picture emerging here. And the picture that I'm seeing is that except for it not being physical sound, it's just like someone is talking to her and she's writing it down. Everything that she says, you almost could, it all fits a situation. Let's say somebody has composed a manuscript really carefully, polished the writing, made sure it's consistent and coherent. And then that person is sitting down and dictating it to Helen. She doesn't have to think up the words. All she has to do is write it down. She has to keep herself out of it. And she can say, hey, can we pause for a sec? Everything she's saying fits that. Nothing she's saying fits the model in which somehow she's co-creating the material. Okay, here we go.
Edited at times, didn't you?
Yes, I did. It would bother me, and I would never forget what it was originally, and I would feel kind of uneasy about it. But since I do so much editing, I figured, well, I'm improving this, and that's it. But then later, when it would pick it up again and refer back to that, then it would be inconsistent because it would use the original word. So then I very quickly learned, don't do that because you will interfere with the internal consistency. So then I stopped doing that. Very quickly I learned that was a very bad mistake. So we went back and we changed all the words back into its original form.
Okay.
This is super uncomfortable. And it's funny because I feel like my heart kind of pounding a little bit because the notes themselves don't actually reflect what Helen just said, especially her last line. So we went back and changed all the words back to their original form. Unfortunately, we know that just isn't true.
We do. Yeah, it's uncomfortable. I love, there's a way that she comes across here that I love, really intelligent, objective observer who's got very human, she's annoyed, she's cross-eyed, she's this and she's that, but she's staying the course with having integrity. And she basically says, and I kept that stance in the editing. I would change things, but I'd remember what they were. I'd realize that they were required for consistency when other material would reference the same word. And yeah, we had to go put it all back. And it's just not what happened. It's not what happened.
Yeah, and you see that reflected in the notes. And this is a really interesting part of the course's story. Here Helen is saying that she considered it a matter of personal integrity not to intrude. And if you look at the preface that she wrote in the Foundation for Inner Peace version of the course, at the very bottom, there's some language from her that says, only a few minor changes have been made. Chapter titles and subheadings have been inserted in the text, and some of the more personal references that occurred at the beginning have been omitted. Otherwise, the material is substantially unchanged. And that's what she's basically saying here in this interview. But what we all came to learn when the notes became public, so you got a copy of the notes around 2005, so about 30 years after the course was originally published. And you can see in the notes that a substantial amount of the material was changed. A substantial amount of material was removed. a substantial amount was replaced. And so there was significant editing to the book. And so, the question is, how are we to view this as students? How are we to thread the needle here between what Helen is saying in this interview and what we know to be true with the editing?
I wish we could ask her how to, it's like we have her report of what happened, and then it's like we have the videotape of what
holding the
actually
bag.
happened. Right. Yeah. I mean, it's right there on video, you could say. There's no ambiguity. I'd like to see what she would say. And for so much of the course, the editing is light and infrequent. It's really mostly in those first several chapters where it's pretty heavy. What I would say is a couple of things. One is she probably considered most of what was removed to be like personal references, which is true of a lot of it, but not all of it by a long, long way. There are other references in there. She probably would make an argument that that was like the stuff on Freud was for their personal integration. I know Bill said that. Stuff on Jung, stuff on Casey was, so they could understand this book. So she may have classed a lot of things under personal information. That's one way to help bridge the gap. The other thing I would say is that she is laying out an ideal here, unambiguously an ideal. And the ideal is don't interfere with this. Don't monkey with it. Don't change the words. And that ideal is completely in keeping with the stance that she's already had, right? That this was not my voice. These were not my words. I'm just taking down what someone else believes. These are not my beliefs. So in keeping with all of that, this editing stance makes perfect sense. But it also is very different than a lot of what I hear these days. What I hear is, well, Helen had this general sense. She put words to it. That was a fine initial draft. Okay, but then as she took editing passes, she found better words to put to it. They were her words all the way along. So why can't she just put better words to it? I hear that a lot. That's utterly alien to what Helen's saying here. So I think we can at least acknowledge that she's laying out an ideal, whether or not she could live up to it. And that ideal is in keeping with her whole picture, which is the agency did not come from her. These were not her ideas. These were not her words. So that has very strong and obvious editing implications.
I want to give Helen the benefit of the doubt here and take seriously what you're saying about just the material that was removed was viewed as being too personal, unimportant. And there's so much other beautiful language. And so what does it matter if 45,000 words come out? On one hand, I want to say that that's the view. I know you were saying before that after you read Ken Wapnick's book, Absence from Felicity, where he talked about the editing process of A Course in Miracles, that when you saw him in 1992, personally, you said, hey, do you know that there's 7,000 words in this book that don't appear in
That's
the
different.
course
You're
itself?
conflating two stories there. No.
Oh, am I?
Yeah. What I said
tell
was
the story.
Okay. So Absence from Felicity blew all of our minds because it revealed there was a lot that she took down that was not in the course. And I mean, we didn't know that. John Money didn't know that, and he knew Helen. And so when I saw Ken, I said, okay, is there more that's still not in there? Is there more? And he said, well, basically, no. He said, there's some stuff about Edgar Casey. There's some stuff about Helen's relationship with her husband, Louis, but basically it's all in Absence from Felicity, except for those two exceptions. And that just wasn't the case. I don't think Ken was just lying. I really don't. I think that
I don't either.
I think that he was just not
clear about that.
Yeah, I just think he was not he did not regard the stuff that was taken out as important. He didn't have his nose in it. And so I just don't think he had a lot of awareness of just how much was in there that didn't appear in the course and also didn't appear in Absence from Felicity.
I also think that there's so many other stories that paint a picture of Helen just not taking the process as seriously as you would expect someone who really believes that they're talking to Jesus. Judy told a story in an interview about Helen where Helen and Judy were talking to some guy who had evidently had all kinds of adventures traveling all around the world. And Helen looked at him and said, "Gosh, your life is so fascinating. Nothing ever happens to me."
That's great. That's great.
What? So I think that there's just an element of the words that weren't sacred to Helen and to some degree to Ken, and that's why they could so easily take this approach of, well, we remove some minor things that don't really change the meaning of the book, which is true. But at the same time, for those of us that take these words, who believe that this is Jesus, who take every single word seriously, this editing process was a massive deal.
It was. But we should, I think, get back to her here, but she sounds like you to some degree, really careful about each and every word because these are not her words. So let's go on. I don't know if I clipped off already part of what Dave said, but he's starting to say, "Did you remember the word?" Okay, so let me start it again here.
Did you remember the word, or did you have to go back and just ask at the time?
And I used to tell Bill that used to be, whatever it was. But sometimes, I wouldn't say more than 2 or 3 times, I didn't know. But I was aware that there was a goof-off in through there, and I would feel the goof-off more than the right answer. And then I would sort of look at a blackboard in my head and see it written, the word it should have been. And I would ask, can I see it on the blackboard?
You would ask and also see it?
Yes, if I was undecided. I'd forgotten to mention that.
Would there also be that knowingness that accompanies it like?
No, then I would be reading it. If it was on the blackboard, I would see it in letters.
Then it was a very visual thing in your mind.
And then it was visual. Ordinarily, it isn't. But I think that modality had to come in where I had kind of lost my way in it, and I really didn't know what the word should be.
I think because we've had this big gap, we should make sure that people get the continuity here. What she's talking about is the process where she had replaced a word with something else, and now she's realized that was a very bad thing, what she called a very bad mistake. That's her exact words. And now she has to go back and put the original word in. And she's saying most of the time she knew what that original word was, so she could do that. But there were other times where she'd forgotten. And then on these very rare occasions, she would use this special method where she'd see a blackboard, she'd ask what the word was, and it would appear in her mind visibly on the blackboard. So that's not how she normally received the information. But it does show, again, something, I don't know how much this even happened. I don't want to imagine it didn't happen at all. I've never seen instances where I can identify for sure that a word was taken out and then put back in. But it does show that she has this consciousness of, these aren't my words. If I, replace a word, it's a very bad mistake. It interferes with consistency. So I've got to put it back. If I can't remember what it was originally, I have to go through this special procedure to remember that right word. And so you cannot come away from this thinking that, in Helen's mind, these are her words. There is no way you can think that and listen to this.
It's true. She really is going to great lengths to give you the impression that she's not interfering with what's coming through at all.
Yeah, she's going to great lengths. And I wish she had lived up to the ideal she lays out here. But we can see why it's the ideal, given her stance on how the material was received.
I think we should be clear that you and I both agree that she held that ideal, genuinely held that ideal.
I think she held it and lived up to it far more in the receiving of the material. I think there was two Helens here. One was the one who heard and wrote down the words. The other was the editor. And I think she lived up to the ideal well enough in the first mode. And she lived up to it, I'm sure, to a large degree in the editor mode, but she also fell quite short of it. And I wish she had just admitted that, because no one could check her at this point. We didn't have the earlier versions. So it was easy for her to say that as the editor, she did live up to the ideal. Now we know she didn't. Shall I go on?
Could you close this off any time you didn't want to hear or do it?
Oh, yes.
In other words, it was strictly your option.
Oh, very much. Except that it kind of nudges me if I didn't do it. When I was sort of supposed to, sometimes I couldn't sleep. And then I would become very restless, and at one point I didn't do it for about 3 weeks. I felt quite pushed around by this, and enough is enough. And it was kind of a rough 3 weeks. But I didn't know when it was finished, and I didn't know when I was supposed to stop. The course came first. Well, the text is what we originally had called the course. The text is the right word for it.
Uh-huh.
That came first, and when that was through, I think there was something like a 3-month hiatus.
Yeah, so this is interesting because she said she never seriously considered quitting, but I think it's clear she had moments of I'm putting my foot down. I'm at least taking a break from this relationship, even if I'm not, breaking up with you, so to speak. So it's also very clear that in this process, it's clear that it's somebody else's project, right? He knows when it's done. He starts it and he stops it, and then she's made aware that it's time to stop.
And Bill, his stories about the origin of the course confirm that, all the way from when Helen called him and said, I think I may have something to do. And she was also worried that she might be going insane because she was hearing this voice. And she said to him, it's saying, this is a Course in Miracles, please take notes. What should I do? And he said, well, I think you should take notes. And so Bill's stories about the process are full of this division with Helen, where she was basically at one point like, if the grammar is wrong, I'm going to stop. If it stops making sense, then I'm going to refuse to take it down. He was helping with her comfort level through the process. And you can see some of that reflected in her words too. Very uncomfortable with this.
Yeah.
You had no urge to write then?
A while before I started in again, I said to Bill and also to Jonathan, I have a horrible feeling there's a workbook that goes with this, but maybe it's just maybe I'm going to be let off on this one. But I did know it, and it became increasingly clear that was it. And I knew at that time there would also be a teacher's manual, because that's obviously what professors have to teach with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I did feel that it was going to organize itself in that way. And it did.
I love when she says, I have a horrible feeling there's going to be a workbook that goes with it. That's hilarious.
Isn't it? It says a lot about her attitude, please let me be done. Yeah. It's also interesting. I don't think there's anywhere else that says that she realized at the time she knew there would be a workbook, she also knew there would be a teacher's manual, because she said, obviously, that's what professors have to teach with, which is personally interesting to me. I know we're getting close to being done with time here, but it's interesting to me that in the preface she wrote, she does not characterize the manual for teachers as a manual for teachers. She characterizes it as a Q&A for students, which I think is very inaccurate. But here she recognizes that's what professors have to teach with. That's why I knew that was coming. That's interesting.
I wish that language that she has in this interview had carried through into the preface of the original publication, because the manual has been underrated, underestimated, because it's just viewed as a throwaway Q&A. But if it had retained its original idea of being a true manual for teachers, I don't think that students would be so dismissive of it all these years later.
And we wouldn't be saying, well, there are no teachers of this course because we're all teachers and students of each other, which everyone says. Okay, let's carry on.
You feel that it's over now?
I think so. I think so. The only thing that I might be able to do, although I would hesitate to do it because I feel very strongly that my commitment included having nothing to do with anything psychic. I feel that very strongly. I think I told you the story of the original commitment in that line. If I didn't, it's in my autobiography and you'll see it. I think it's through. I do think, and under certain circumstances, I might be able to do this and might want to, if it were very helpful to somebody. I think there are questions I could probably write an answer to. But I think I would really want to do that, not as a major part of anything, because I don't think it's very important, but if someone were in trouble and it would be helpful, I might try to do it. I haven't had any occasion.
What strikes me is she's not saying, like, Jesus has other things he wants me to write. One of the very last things she took down, which is included in the Gifts of God, has this line said to Helen, you still are needed in the world to hear his voice, and meaning God's voice, and share his messages of love with those who call in sorrow. She's still needed for that, even though she's finishing up her scribal career at that point. Meanwhile, a couple of years before this, she's like, there might be more for me to do. I could kind of function like a psychic if somebody felt like they were in trouble and had a question they need answering. I could do that. It shows how much she wants to be done with the scribal role that we've been talking about here.
Horrible feeling. There's a workbook coming.
Right. Right.
I know, but God, you wish that she would have carried on with it. I was saying to you earlier today that on one hand, I really feel for her. This is a 7-year scribal process where she very much felt at the effect of it, waking her up in the middle of the night, that kind of thing. And it wasn't her plan for her life. And I'm sure she had other things that she wanted to do. But at the same time, what a gift to the world. I don't think anybody has had a pipeline like what Helen had to Jesus. And I would have absolutely loved to have seen more come through her and more interviews with her as well.
Before we go on, it really reminds me of the scene from Good Will Hunting, where Will Hunting is this like once in 1,000-year mathematical genius. And he's come up with some formula that for him is totally easy. And he wants to show his teacher how little it means to him. So he sets fire to it. And the teacher's like, no. And he's like trying to put the fire out. He's like, you don't realize the importance of what you can come up with so easily. And I feel like same with Helen. Okay.
I always think of her resurrection guidance where there's a cameo 33 in the CE where the story is that Ken was talking to Helen and he was asking about the resurrection of Jesus, and they had questions about it. And Ken was like, well, why don't you ask? And this most beautiful guidance comes through that answers the question. And Helen had that on tap. And that's an incredible thing.
Yeah.
And on one hand, I feel like, let's just be grateful for what we have. And on the other, it's like, she was still needed to do more.
She had that on tap, and yet here she's talking about, to refer to it somewhat dismissively, like, I think I'll open a psychic hotline. Like, no, we need the wisdom from Jesus. Anyway.
I know that's what's so funny about the story of like, nothing interesting ever happens to me. It's like, really, Helen?
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
So you continue to hear the voice.
Oh, no, I could ask what to do about something, particularly if the three of us are together. And we would ask, and we would get an answer. We generally get the same answer. If we don't, we'll sort of feel somebody's off a little bit, and we'll try again. But we generally do. According to the Course, we should, and everyone could, ask about anything and get an answer. Sometimes it's very surprising to me, and one of the things that I think we mistakenly do is to figure, oh, well, this is unimportant, or this is, this, or to cut out certain areas from the process of asking, which I'm sure is a mistake, because I don't think we should evaluate. I think you can ask anything. And I would doubt very much if anything is likely to happen to me that wouldn't happen to anybody else. If he wanted it to. I mean, or if he felt this was the way he wanted to go. I can't imagine that. In fact, I'm sure it isn't true. The Course is rather explicit on that.
We could park here for a while, but this is important stuff. Yeah.
We could do a whole podcast on just that little section. We won't, because I know we're running over, but that's incredible what she says on guidance there.
Yeah, she says a couple of things. One is that when she and Bill and Ken Wapnick sit down to get guidance together, they generally all get the same thing. If they don't, someone's a little off and they'll try again. And then she goes into the fact that we could and should ask about anything, and we shouldn't be thinking, well, this is unimportant. This is kind of outside of what we should ask for guidance about. We should be asking about anything and everything, and we have a right to receive those answers. So she comes down very clearly on this issue of guidance, which has kind of gotten muddied, I think. It's got the rumor has gotten around that we shouldn't be asking for guidance about the decisions in this world. And the Course is super clear on that. And Helen knew it. She was clear on it. Getting towards the end here.
So you do hear now and then.
I hear whenever I ask.
In other words, at this point now, it's really a matter of asking.
Well, now it's a little more a question of personal guidance as to what to do. We didn't know whether we were supposed to come here, for example, so we asked about that. And we all three thought we should come to California. This was not where we intended to go. And we did feel that Judy sort of came, at a particular time. We felt very much that she was an integral part of this. But we asked for this because I've been very, very careful about this. I am a very careless person in some ways. I lose everything. But I never lost anything of this Course. People would stop me in the subway and say, "Miss, you forgot your something or other," and hand it back to me. Taxis would honk their horns, say you left something in the back seat. My secretary would say, "Are you sure this belongs in this case report? Doesn't sound right." And it was impossible to lose this Course, and I tried. But it sort of kind of followed me around in an odd kind of way. People would send it back to me, anything, and I always got it back. And we never lost anything, which is incredible for me. You have to know me because I really do lose anything. We once went.
I should just set up a little bit what's coming. She and Bill went to like it sounds like a faculty party or something where they played this game. And then you also need to know that right before this interview, she had retired from being a professor, or I think associate professor. So that's all important context.
To a game thing, where you had to guess from a one-sentence thing who it was, and somebody said, "My God, where is it?" And the whole faculty said, "Helen Schucman." They recognized it immediately. I'm better now. I think this has been a good experience.
You're the absent-minded professor type?
No more. Now I'm just absent-minded.
That is great at the end, where
that's great.
It's just so poignant that she's just retired. And he said, "You're the absent-minded professor." And she says, "No more." I'm just absent-minded.
Yeah.
If we only have this as one of our interviews with Helen, it's a really sweet way for it to end.
Really sweet way. Yeah. I like that ending a
Okay.
lot. Yeah. So what she's saying is we asked about coming to California where the interview took place. I've been very careful about when she says this, I think she means the course. And then she basically says, even though I lose everything, I've never managed to lose any bit of the course. Anything that she had written down. And apparently there were a lot of possibilities. I mean, we've heard one story that Kim Wapnick related, but apparently she had a lot of instances where she could have lost it. Anyway, there was clearly her sense was somebody was looking out for that material and making sure it was preserved.
It's just also on this point of asking, I know we're not in a guidance podcast, but I think it's interesting to note that Helen had Jesus on tap so clearly, and yet she still had to ask in order to receive guidance.
Mm-hmm.
And you would think that wouldn't be the case. And so often when we hear people talk about guidance, there's a sense of, well, I don't need to ask, I just know. Well, Helen heard more clearly than anyone, I think, who's existed, and she had to ask still. So
yeah, it's true.
Okay, so just kind of wrapping, that was the end of the interview. So just wrapping all this up, let's talk about the overall significance of the interview as we close. As I mentioned, it's important simply because this is one of the only audios we have of her. And so it gives us a window in her own mind and in her own words about the scribal process and her approach to it. So what beyond that would you say is significant about this piece of audio that we have from Helen?
There is so much. I feel like I want to go in there and do a written piece because there's so much. I mean, the questioner is good. Dave does a good job at interviewing. My picture right now is that as she is trying to describe what happened to her, she does do a good job of playing the objective, almost like naturalist who is trying to be really faithful to the data before her. In terms of where the material came from, she's very clear that no external agency took her over. But she's also very clear that the agency was not hers. It appeared in her mind, but it was another agency than her own that had the idea for the project, that kept her going through it, kept nudging her when she would take breaks, that knew when it was going to end, that knew the overall structure of it, that knew where the sentences were going, and just fed her one word after another, as if somebody was sitting right there reading, dictating a manuscript to her, the only difference being that it was an inner dictation rather than an outer dictation. But it was still coming to her, not from her. It was still very rapid. It was still already composed and polished. And her job was not to produce it or even co-produce it. Her job was to do what she does in this interview, to be the kind of impartial one who's just passing on what is before her or coming through her and trying to keep herself out of it. So you really get a very clear sense of what was not going on with this process and with what was going on. And in terms of what was going on, the whole picture that she conveys in so many different ways is this material was given to her one word at a time rather than being produced or co-produced by her.
Agreed. I just don't think a human mind could have come up with these words. They are among the most wise and beautiful ever given to the world. And we're also grateful to Helen for sharing her gift with us. And so thank you, Robert, for the idea to analyze this recording. I think it was a really interesting exercise. And
it's priceless recording.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're grateful to have it. as well as the course itself. Thank you also to those of you who are here joining us live. If you would like to join us for a future recording of Exploring A Course in Miracles, please go to circleofa.org/events and you'll find how to access it there. And we look forward to seeing you on a future broadcast. Thanks so much for listening, and bye for now.